This segment is on the ventricles of the brain and the cranial meninges. The brain is encased in layers of tough, protective cranial meninges. The cerebrospinal fluid circulated between certain meningeal layers cushions the brain and prevents it from contacting the cranial bones during a head injury, like airbags in a car prevents a passenger from hitting the dashboard. The cranial meninges are anatomically similar to and continuous with the spinal meninges of the spinal cord. The cranial meninges consist of 3 layers: the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater is the outer meningeal covering consisting of 2 layers. Between the 2 layers are large blood sinuses, collectively called the dural sinuses, that drain blood from the cranial veins into the jugular veins of the neck. Between the dura mater and the underlying arachnoid mater is the subdural space. Deep to the dura mater is the arachnoid mater, named after the web-like connection this membrane has with the underlying pia mater. On the surface of the brain is the pia mater, which contains many blood vessels supplying the brain. Between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is the subarachnoid space, where cerebrospinal fluid circulates. The dura mater has extensions that help stabilize the brain. A mid-sagittal fold in the dura mater forms the falx cerebri and separates the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. Posteriorly, the dura mater folds again as the tentorium cerebelli and separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. The falx cerebelli is a dural fold between the hemispheres of the cerebellum. Deep in the brain are 4 chambers called ventricles. 2 lateral ventricles, one in each cerebral hemisphere, extend deep into the cerebrum as horse-shaped chambers. Cerebrospinal fluid circulates from the lateral ventricles through the interventricular foramen and enters the 3rd ventricle. The 3rd ventricle is a small chamber in the diencephalon. Cerebrospinal fluid in the 3rd ventricle passes through the aqueduct of the midbrain and enters the 4th ventricle, that is located between the brainstem and the cerebellum. Cerebrospinal fluid is directed to the exterior of the brain and the spinal cord and into the subarachnoid space. Cerebrospinal fluid in the 3rd ventricle passes through the aqueduct of the midbrain and enters the 4th ventricle, that is located between the brainstem and the cerebellum. Cerebrospinal fluid is directed to the exterior of the brain and the spinal cord and into the subarachnoid space. Cerebrospinal fluid then circulates around the brain and the spinal cord and is reabsorbed by arachnoid granulations, which project into the veins of the dural sinuses. Inside each ventricle is a specialized capillary called the choroid plexus, where cerebrospinal fluid is produced.